Society in Man. In the preceding chapter, we may have given the reader excellent grounds to cite that sociology is ready to take over the title of the dismal science from economics, having presented the reader with an image of society as a forbidding prison. We ought now to indicate at least some escape tunnels from this gloomy determinism. Before we try to do this, however, we must deepen the gloom a little more. So far, approaching society mainly under the aspect of its control systems, we have viewed the individual and society as two entities confronting each other. Society has been conceived as an external reality that exerts pressure and coercion upon the individual. If this picture were left unmodified, one would obtain a quite erroneous impression of the actual relationship, namely an impression of masses of men constantly straining at their laces, surrendering to their controlling authorities with gnashing teeth, constantly driven to obedience by fear of what may happen to them otherwise. But common sense knowledge of society and sociological analysis probably tell us that this is not so. For most of us, the yoke of society seems easy to bear. Why? Certainly not because the power of society is less than we indicated in the last chapter. Why then do we not suffer more from this power? The sociological answer to this question has already been alluded to because most of the time we ourselves desire just that we that which associate expects of us. We want to obey the rules. We want to paths that society has assigned to us. And this is in turn is possible not because the power of society is less, but because it is much more than we have so far accepted. Society not only determines what we do, but also what we are. In other words, social allocation involves our being as well as our conduct. For, expli- for explicate these crucial elements of sociological perspective, we shall now look at three further areas of investigation and interpretation, those of role theory, the sociology of knowledge, and reference group theory. Role theory has been almost entirely an American intellectual development. Some of its germinal insights go back to William James, while its direct parents are two other American thinkers, Charles Cooley and George Herbert Mead. It cannot be our purpose here to give an historical introduction to this fascinating portion of intellectual history, rather than they say this even in outline. We shall start more systematically by beginning our consideration of the import of role theory with another look at Thomas' concept of the definition of the definition of the situation. The reader will the reader will call Thomas' understanding of the social situation as a sort of reality agreed upon ad hoc by those who participate in it, or more exactly, those who do the defining of the situation. From the, from the viewpoint of the individual participant, this means that each situation he enters confronts him with specific expectations and demands at him that demands of him specific responses to this expectation. As we have already seen, powerful pressures exist in just about any social situation to ensure that the proper responses are indeed forthcoming. Society can exist by virtue of the fact that most of the time most people's definitions of the most important situations at least coincide approximately. The motives of the publisher and the writer of these lines may be rather different, but the ways to define situation in which this book is being produced are sufficiently similar for the joint venture to be possible. In similar fashion, there may be quite divergent interests present in a classroom of students, some of them having little connection with the educational activity that is supposedly going on, but in most cases, these interests say that one student came to study the subject being taught, while another simply registers for every course taken by a certain head he is pursuing. Can coexist in the situation without destroying it. In other words, there is a certain amount of leeway in the extent to which a response must meet expectation for a situation to remain sociologically viable. Of course, if the definition of the situation are too widely discrepant, some form some form of social conflict or disorganization will inevitably result. Say, if some students interpret the classroom meeting as a party, or if an author has no intention of producing a book but is using his contract with one publisher to put pressure on another. While an average individual meets up with very different expectations in different areas of his life or in society, the situation that produce these expectations fall into certain clusters. A student may take two courses from two different professors in two different departments with considerable variations in the with expectation met within the two situations, say, as between formality or informality in the relations between professor and students. Nevertheless, the situations will be sufficiently similar to each other and to other classroom situations previously experienced to enable the student to carry into both situations essentially the same overall response. In other words, in both cases, but with but a few modifications, he will be able to play the role of student. A role then may be defined as a typical response to a typified expectation. Society has predefined the fundamental typology, to use the language of the theater, from which the concept of role is derived. We can say that society provides the script of our all, the dramatis personae. The individual actors, therefore, need but step into the roles already assigned to them before the curtain goes up. As long as they play the roles as provided for in this script, the social play can proceed as planned. The role provides the pattern according to which the individual is to act in the particular situation. Roles in society as in the theater will vary in the exactness with which they lay down instructions for the actor. Taking occupational roles for an instance, a fairly minimal pattern goes into the role of garbage collector, while physicians or clergymen or officers have to acquire all kinds of distinctive mannerisms, speech and motor habits, such as military bearing, sanctimonious diction, or beside cheer. It would, however, be missing an essential aspect of the role if one regarded it merely as a regulatory pattern for externally visible actions. One feels more ardent by kissing, more humble by kneeling, and more angry by shaking one's fist. That is, the kiss not only expresses a dog but manufactures it. Roles carry with them both certain actions and the emotions and attitudes that belong to these actions. The professor putting on an act that pretends to wisdom comes to feel wise. The preacher finds himself believing what he preaches. The soldier discovers martial stirrings in his breast as he puts on his uniform. In each case, while the emotion or attitude may have been present before the role was taken on, the latter inevitably strengthens what was there before. In many instances, there is every reason to suppose that nothing at all atten- anteceded the playing of the role in the actor's consciousness. In other words, one becomes wise by being appointed a professor, believing by engaging in activities the presupposed belief, and ready for battle by marching in formation. Let us take an example. A man recently commissioned as an officer, especially if he came up through the ranks, will at first be at least slightly embarrassed by the salutes he now receives for the enlisted men he meets on his way. Probably he will respond to them in a friendly, almost apologetic manner. The new insignia on his uniform are at that are at that point still something that he has merely put on, almost like a disguise. Indeed, the new officer may even tell himself and others that underneath he is still the same person, that he simply has new responsibilities, among which and passant is the duty to accept the salutes of enlisted men. This attitude is not likely to last very long. In order to carry out his new role of officer, our men must maintain a certain bearing. This bearing has quite definite implications, despite all the double talk in this area that is customary in so-called democratic armies, such as the American one. One of the fundamental implications is that an officer is a superior somebody entitled to obedience and respect on the basis of this superiority. Every military salute given by an inferior in rank is an act of obeisance, receiving as a matter of course by the one who returns it. Thus, with every salute given and accepted, along of course with the 100 other ceremonial acts that enhance his new status, our man is fortified in his new bearing, and it's, as it were, ontological presuppositions. He not only acts like an officer, he feels like one. Gone are the embarrassment, the apologetic attitude, the I am just another guy really green. If on some occasion an enlisted man should fail to salute with the appropriate amount of enthusiasm or even commit the unthinkable act of failing to salute at all, our officer is not merely going to punish a violation of military regulations. He will be driven with every fiber of his being to redress an offense against the appointed order of his cosmos. It is important to stress in this illustration that only very rarely is such a process deliberate or based on reflection. Our man has not sat down and figured out all the things that ought to go into his new role, including the things that he ought to feel and believe. The strength of the process comes precisely from its unconscious, reflecting character. He has become an officer almost almost as effortlessly as he grew into a person with blue eyes, brown hair, and a height of 6 feet. Nor would it be correct to say that our man just be rather stupid and quite an exception among his comrades. On the contrary, the exception is the man who reflects on his role, and his role changes, a type by his way, who would probably make a poor officer. Even very intelligent people, when faced with doubt about their role in society, will involve themselves even more in the doubtedly activity rather than withdraw into reflection. The theologian who doubts his faith will pray more and increase his church attendance. The businessman, beset by qualms about his rat race activities, starts going to the office on Sundays too, and the terrorist who suffers from nightmares volunteers for nocturnal execution. And of course, they are perfectly correct in this course of action. Each role has its inner discipline, what Catholic monastics would call it a formation. The role forms, shapes, patterns what action and actor. It is very difficult to pretend in this world. Normally, one becomes what one plays at. One, what one plays at. Every role in society has attached to it a certain identity, As we have seen, some of these identities are trivial and temporary ones, as in some occupations they demand little modification in the being of the practitioners. It is not difficult to change from garbage collector to night watchman. It is considerably more difficult to change from clergyman to officer. It is very, very difficult to change from negro to white. It is almost impossible to change from the man to woman. These differences in the ease of role changing ought not to blind us to the fact that even identities that we consider to be our essential selves have been social assigned. Just as there are racial roles to be acquired and identified with, so there are sexual roles. To say I am a man is just as much a proclamation of role as to say I am a colonel in the US Army. We are we are well aware to the fact that one is born a male while not even the most humorless martinet imagines himself to have been born with a golden eagle sitting on his umbilical cord. To be, to be biologi- biologically male is a far cry from the specific, social defined, and of course social relative role that goes with the statement I am a man. A male, a male child does not have to learn to have an erection, but he must learn to be aggressive, to have ambitions, to compete with others, and to suspicious of too much gentleness in himself. The main role in our society, however, requires all these things that one must learn, as does a male identity. To have an erection is not enough. If it were, regimens of psychotherapists would be out of work. This significance of role theory could be summarized by saying that, in a sociological perspective, identity is socially bestowed, socially sustained, and socially transformed. The example of the man is process of becoming an officer may suffice to illustrate the way in which identities are bestowed in adult life. However, even roles that are much more fundamentally part of what psychologists would call our personality than those associated with a particular adult activity are bestowed in very similar manner to a social process. This has been demonstrated over and over again in studies of so-called socialization, the process by which a child learns to be a participant member of society. Probably the most penetrating theoretical account of the process is the one given by Mead, in which the genesis of the self is interpreted as being one and the same event as the discovery of society. The child finds out who he is as he learns what society is. He learns to play roles properly belonging to him by learning, as Mead put it, to take the role of the other, which, incidentally, is the crucial socio-physiological function of play, in which children must create with a variety of social goals and in doing so discover the significance of those being assigned to them. All this learning occurs and can only occur in interaction with other human beings, be it the parents of whoever else raised the child. The child first takes on roles vis-a-vis what Mead calls his significant others, that is, those persons who deal with him intimately and whose attitudes are decisive for the formation of his conception of himself. Later, the child learns that the roles he plays are not only relevant to this intimate cycle, but relate to the expectation directed toward him by society at large. This higher level of this higher level of abstraction in the social response made caused the discovery of the generalist order. That is, not only the child's mother expects him to be good, clean, and truthful, society in general does so as well. Only when this general conception of society emerges is the child capable of forming a clear conception of himself. Self and society in the child experience are the two sides of the same coin. In other words, identity is not something given, but is bestowed in acts of social recognition. We become that as which we are addressed. The same idea is expressed in Goldie's well-known description of the self as a reflection in a looking glass. This does not mean, of course, that there are not certain characteristics an individual is born with that are carried by his genetic heritage regardless of the social environment in which the latter will have to unfold itself. Our knowledge of man's biology does not as yet allow us a very clear picture of the extent to which this may be true. We do know, however, that the room of social formation within those genetic limits is very large indeed. Even with the biological questions left largely unsettled, we can say that those we can say that to be human is to be recognized as a human, just as to be a certain kind of man is to be recognized as such. The child, deprived of human affection and attention, becomes the humanist. The child who is given respect comes to respect himself. A little boy considered to be a Slemiel becomes one, just as a grown-up treated as an awe-inspiring young god of work begins to think of himself and act as is appropriate to such a figure, and indeed merge his identity with the one he is presented within this expectation. Identities are socially bestowed. They must also be socially sustained, and fairly steadily so. One cannot be human all by oneself and, apparently, one cannot hold on to any particular identity all by oneself. The self-image of the officer as an officer can be maintained only in a social context in which others are willing to recognize him in this identity. If this recognition is suddenly withdrawn, it usually does not take very long before the self-image collapses. Cases of radical withdrawal of recognition by society can tell us can tell us much about the social character of identity. For example, a man turned overnight from a free citizen into a convict finds himself subjected at once to a massive assault on his previous conception of himself. He may try desperately to hold on to the latter, but in the absence of other in his immediate environment confirming his own identity, he will find it almost impossible to maintain it within his own consciousness. With frightening speed, he will discover that he is acting as a convict is supposed to, and feeling all the things that a convict is expected to feel. It would be a misleading perspective on this process to look upon it simply as one of the restoration of personality. A more accurate way of seeing the phenomenon is as reintegration of personality, no different in its socio-physiological dynamics from the process in which the old identity was integrated. It used to be that our man was treated by all the important people around him as responsible, dignified, considerate, and aesthetically fastidious. Consequently, he was able to be all these things. Now, the walls of the prison separate him from those whose recognition sustained him in the exhibition of these traits. Instead, he is now surrounded by people who treat him as irresponsible, swinish in behavior, not only for his own not only for his own interest and careless of his appearance unless forced to take care by constant supervision. The new expectations are typified in the conflict role that responds to them, just as the old ones were integrated into a different pattern of conduct. In both cases, identity comes with conduct and conduct occurs in response to a specific social situation. Extreme cases in which an individual is radically stripped of his old identity simply is to treat more sharply processes that occur in ordinary life. We live or we live our everyday life. We live our everyday lives within a complex web of recognition and non-recognitions. We work better when we are given encouragement by our superiors. We find it hard to be anything but clumsy in us getting where we know people have an image of us as awkward. We become when people expect us to be funny and interesting characters when we know that such a reputation has preceded us. Intelligence, humor, manual skills, religious devotion, and even sexual potential respond with equal alacrity to the expectations of others. This makes understandable the previously mentioned process by which individuals choose their associates in such a way that the, the latter sustain their self-interpretations. To put this succinctly, every act, every act of social affiliation entails a choice of identity. Conversely, every identity requires specific social affiliations for its survival. Birds of the same feather flock together not as luxury but out of necessity. The intellectual becomes a slave after he is kidnapped by the army. The theological student progressively loses his sense of humor as he approaches ordination. The worker who breaks all norms finds that he breaks even more after he has been given a medal by management. The young man, with anxieties about his virility, becomes hell on wheels in bed when he finds a girl who sees him as an avatar of Don Giovanni. To relate these observations to what was said in the last chapter, the individual locates himself in society within systems of social control, and every one of these contains an identity-generating apparatus. Insofar as he is able, the individual will try to manipulate his affiliations, and especially his intimate ones, in such a way as to fortieth the identities that have given him satisfaction in the past, marrying a girl who thinks he has something to say, choosing friends who regard him as entertaining, selecting an occupation that gives him recognition as up and coming. In many cases, of course, such manipulation is not possible. One must then do the best one can with the identity one is drawn. Such sociological perspective on the chapter of identity gives us a deeper understanding of the human meaning of prejudice. As a result, we obtain the chilling perception that the prejudging not the prejudging not only concern the victim's eternal fate at the hand of his oppressors, but also his consciousness as it is shaped by their expectations. The most terrible thing that prejudice can do to a human being is to make him tend to become what the prejudiced image of him says that he is. The Jew is an anti-Semitic milieu. The Jew in anti-Semitic milieu must struggle hard not to become more and more like the anti-Semitic stereotype as much the Negro in a racist situation. Significantly, this struggle will only have a chance of success when the individual is protected from succumbing to the prejudice program for his personality by what he could call the counter-recognition of those within his immediate community. The Gentile world might recognize him as but another despicable Jew of non-consequence and treat him accordingly, but this non-recognition of his worth may be balanced by the counter-recognition of him within the Jewish community itself as, say, the greatest Talmudic scholar in Latvia. In view of the socio-physical dynamics of this deadly game of recognitions, it should not surprise us that the problem of Jewish identity arose only among modern Western Jews when assimilation into surrounding Gentile society had begun to weaken the power of the Jewish community itself to bestow an alternate identities on its members as against the identities assigned to them by antisemitism. As an individual is forced to gaze at himself in a mirror so constructed as to let him see a leering monster, he must frantically search for other men with other mirrors, unless he is to forget that he ever had another face. To to put this a little differently, human dignity is a matter of social permission. The same relationship between society and identity can be seen in the cases where, for one reason or another, an individual's identity is drastically changed. The transformation of identity, just as its genesis and its maintenance, is a is a social process. We have already indicated the way in which an reinterpretation of the past, any alternation from one self-image to another, requires the presence of a group that conspires to bring about metamorphosis. What anthropologists call a rite of passage involves repudiation of an old identity, say, to a big a child, and the initiation into a new one, such as that of adult. Modern societies have built the rites of passage as in the institution of the engagement by which the individual is gently led by a general conspiracy of all concerned over the threshold between bachelor freedom and the captivity of marriage. If it were not for this institution, many more would panic at the last moment before the enormity of what they are about to undertake. We have also seen how alternation operates to change identities in such highly started situations as religious training or psychoanalysis. Again, taking the latter as a timely illustration, it involves an intensive social situation in which an individual is led to repudiate his past conception of himself and to take on a new identity, the one that has been programmed from him in the psychoanalytic ideology, what psychoanalysis call transference, the intense social relationship between analyst and analysand is essentially the creation of an artificial social milieu within which the alchemy of transformation can occur. That is, within which this alchemy can become plausible to the individual. The longer the relationship lasts and the more intensive it becomes, the more committed does the individual becomes to his new identity. Finally, when he is killed, this new identity has indeed become what he is. It will not do, therefore, to dismiss with a Marxist guffaw the psychoanalysis claim that his treatment is more effective if the patient sees him frequently does so over a long time and pays a considerable fee. While it is obviously in the analyst economic interest to hold to this position, it is quite plausible sociologically that the position is factually correct. That what is actually done in psychoanalysis is that a new identity is constructed. The individual's commitment to this new identity will obviously increase to the more intensively, the longer and the more painfully he invests in its manufacture. Certainly, his capacity to reject the whole business as a fact has become rather minimal after an investment of several years of his life and thousands of dollars of hard-earned cash. The same kind of alchemistic environment is established in situations of group therapy. The recent popularity of the latter in American psychiatry can again not be interpreted simply as an economic rationalization. It has its sociological basis in the perfectly correct understanding that group pressure, group pressures work effectively to make the individual accept the new mirror image that is being presented to him. Erving Goffman, a contemporary sociologist, has given a vivid description of how these pressures work in the context of a mental hospital, with the patients finally selling out to the psychiatric interpretation of their existence that is the common frame of reference of the therapeutic group. The same process occurs whenever an entire group of individuals is to be broken and made to accept a new definition of themselves. It happens in basic training for draftees in the army, much more intensively in the training of personnel of a permanent career in the army, as at military academies. It happens in the indoctrination and formation programs of cadres for totalitarian organizations such as the Nazi SS or the Communist Party elite. It has happened for many centuries in monast noviates. It has recently been applied to the point of scientific precision in the brainwashing techniques employed against prisoners of totalitarian secret police organizations. The violence of such procedures, as compared with the more routine initiations of society, is to be explained sociologically in terms of the radical degree of transformation of identity that is sought and the functional necessity in these cases that commitment to the transformed identity be foolproof against new alternation. Role theory, when pursued to its logical conclusions, does far more than provide us with a convenient shorthand for the description of various social activities. It gives us a sociological anthropology that is a view of man based on his existence in society. This view tells us that man plays dramatic parts in the grand play of society, and that, speaking sociologically, he is the mask and that he must wear to do so. The human person also appears now in a dramatic context through its theatrical etymology, persona, the technical term given to the actor's mask in the classical theater. The person is perceived as a repertoire of or of roles, each one properly equipped with a certain identity. The range of an individual person can be measured by the number of roles he is capable of playing. The person's biography now appears to us as an uninterrupted sequence of stage performance plays, played to different audiences, sometimes involving drastic changes of custom, always demanding that the actor be what he is playing. Such a sociological view of personality is far more radical in its challenge to the way that we commonly think of ourselves than our psychological theories. It challenged radically one of the fondest presuppositions about the self, its continuity. Looked at sociologically, the self is no longer a solid, given entity that moves for one situation to another. It is rather a process continuously created and recreated in each social situation that one enters, held together by the slender thread of memory. How slender this thread is, we have seen in our discussion of the reinterpretation of the past. Nor is it possible within this framework of our understanding to take refuge in the unconscious as a containing the real contents of the self, because the presumed unconscious self is just as subject to social reproduction as is the so-called conscious one, as we have seen. In other words, man is not also a social being, but he is social in every aspect of his being that is open to empirical investigation. Still speaking sociologically, then, if one wants to ask who an individual really in this is in the kaleidoscope of roles and identities, one can answer only by enumerating the situations in which he is one thing and those in which he is another. Now, it is clear that such transformations can occur at infinitum, and some are easier than others. An individual becomes so habituated to certain identities that even when his social situation changes, he has difficulty keeping up with expectations newly directed toward him. The difficulties that Hadley and previously highly active individuals have when they are forced to retire from their occupation shows this very clearly. The transformability of the self depends not only on its social context, but also on the degree of its habituation to previous identities and perhaps also on certain genetically given traits. While these modifications in our model are necessary to avoid a radicalization of our position, they do not detract appreciably for the discontinuity of the self as revealed by sociological analysis. If this not very edifying anthropological model is reminiscent of any other, it would be of that employed in early Buddhist psychology in India, in which the self was compared to a long row of candles, each of which lights the wick of its neighbor and is extinguished in that moment. The Buddhist psychologists use this picture to decry the Hindu notion of the transmigration of the soul, meaning to say thereby that by there is no entity that passes from one candle to another, but the same picture fits our present anthropological model quite well. One might obtain the impression from all of this that there is really no essential difference between most people and those afflicted with what psychiatry calls multiple personality. If someone wanted to harp on the word essential here, the sociologist may agree with this statement. The actual difference, however, is that for normal people, that is, those so recognized by their society, there are strong pressures toward consistency in the various roles they play and the identities that go with these roles. These pressures are both external and internal. Externally, the others with whom was made, with whom one must play one's social games, and on whose recognition one's own parts demand that one presents at least a relatively consistent picture to the world. A certain degree of role discrepancy may be permitted, but if certain tolerance limits of our past society will withdraw its recognition of the individual definition, defining him as a moral of or psychological aberration. The society will allow will allow an individual to be an emperor at work and not serve at home, but it will not permit him to impersonate a police officer or to wear a costume assigned to the other sex. In order to stay within the limits set to his masquerades, the individual may have to resort to complicated maneuvers to make sure that one role remains segregated from the other. The imperial role in the office is endangered by the appearance of one's wife at a directors' meeting, or one's role in one cycle as an accomplished raconteur is threatened by by intuition of someone from that other cycle in which one has been typed as the fellow who never opens his mouth without putting his foot into it. Such glorious segregation is increasingly possible in our contemporary urban civilization, with its anonymity and its means of rapid transportation. Although even here there is a danger that people with contradictory images of oneself may suddenly bump into each other and endanger one's whole stage management. Wife and secretary might meet over coffee, and between them they reduce both himself and of himself to pitiable shambles. At this point, for sure, one will require a psychotherapist to put a new Humpty Dumpty together again. There are also internal pressures toward consistency, possibly based on very profound psychological needs to perceive oneself as a totality. Even the contemporary urban masquerader, who plays mutual irreconcilable roles in different areas of his life, may feel internal tensions, though he can successfully control external ones by carefully segregating his several misses and skin for, for each other. To avoid such anxieties, people commonly segregate their consciousness as well as their conduct, but this we do not mean that they repress the discrepant identities into some unconscious, for within our model we have every reason to be suspicious of such concept. We rather mean that they focus their attention only on that particular identity that, so to speak, they require at the moment. Other identities are forgotten for the duration of this particular act. This way, in which social disproved sexual acts or morally questionable acts of any kind are segregated in consciousness, may serve to illustrate this process. The man who engages in, say, homosexual masochism has a carefully constructed identity set aside for just these occasions. When any given occasion is over, that he checks that identity again at the gate, so to speak, and return home as a affectionate father, responsible husband, perhaps even an ardent lover of his wife. In the same way, the judge who sentences a man to death segregates the identity in which he does this from the rest of his consciousness, in which he is kindly, tolerant, and sensitive human being. The Nazi concentration camp commander who writes sentimental letters to his children is but an extreme case of something that occurs in society all the time. It would be a complete misunderstanding of what has just been said if the reader now thought that we are presenting a picture of society in which everybody seems, plots, and deliberately plots on disguises to fool his fellow men. On the contrary, role-playing and an identity building processes are generally unreflected and unplanned, almost automatic. The psychological needs for consistency of self-image just mentioned insert this. Deliberate deception requires a degree of psychological self-control that few people are capable of. That is why insincerity is rather a rare phenomenon. Most people are sincere because this is the easiest course to take psychologically. That is, they believe in their own fact, conveniently forget the act of that preceded it, and happily go through life in the conviction of being responsible in all its demands. Sincerity is the consciousness of the man who is taken in by his own fact, or as it has been put by David Risman, the sincere man is the one who believes in in his own propaganda. In view of the socio-physiological dynamics just discussed, it is much more likely that the Nazi murderers are sincere in their self-portrayals as having been bureaucrats faced with certain unpleasant exigencies that actually were deceitful to them than to assume that they said this only in order to gain sympathy from their judges. The human remorse is probably just as sincere as the erstwhile cruelty, as the Austrian novelist Robert Musil has put it, in every murderer's heart there is a spot in which he is eternally innocent. The seasons of life follow one another, and one must change one face as one changes one's clothes. At the moment, we are not concerned with the psychological difficulties or the ethical import of such lack of character. We only want to stress that it is the customary procedure. To tie up what has just been said about role theory, which was, which was said in the preceding chapter about control systems, we refer to what Hasgett and C. Wright Mills have called person selection. Every social, every social structure selects those persons that it needs for its functioning and eliminates in other way in one way or another that or another those that do not fit. If no persons are available to be selected, they will have to be invented, or rather, they will be produced in accordance with the required specifications. In this way, through its mechanism of socialization and formation, society manufactures the persona it requires to keep going. The sociologist stand on its head the common sense idea that certain institutions arise because there are certain persons around. On the contrary, fierce warriors appear because there are armies to be sent out, pious men because there are churches to be built, scholars because there are universities to be staffed, and murderers because there are killings to be performed. It is not correct to say that each society gets the men it deserves. Rather, each society produces the men it needs. We can derive some comfort from the fact that this production process sometimes runs into technical difficulties. We shall see later that it can also be sabotaged. For the moment, however, we can see that role theory and its concomitant perceptions add an important dimension to our sociological perspective on human existence. If role theory provides us with the vivid insights into the presence of society in man, similar insights from a very different starting point can be obtained for the so-called sociology of knowledge. Unlike role theory, the sociology of knowledge is European in origin. The term was first coined in the 1920s by German philosopher Max Scheler. Another European scholar, Karl Mannheim, who spent the closing years of his life in England, is largely responsible for bringing the new discipline to the attention of Anglo-Saxon thought. This is not the place to go into the very intriguing intellectual history of the sociology of knowledge, which include Marx, Nietzsche, and German historicism. The way, the way the sociology of knowledge fits into our argument is by showing us that, that ideas as well as men, the idea as well as men are socially located, and this indeed can serve a definition of the discipline for our purposes. The sociology of knowledge concerns itself with the social location of ideas. The sociology of knowledge, more clearly than any other branch of sociology, makes clear what is meant by saying that the sociology is the guy who keeps asking, says who. It rejects the pretense that thought occurs in oscillations from the social context within which particular men think about particular things, even in the case of very abstract ideas that seemingly have little social connection. The sociology of knowledge attempts to draw the line from the thought to the thinker to his social world. This can be seen more easily in thought in those instances when serves when two serves to legitimate a particular social situation, that is, when it explains, justifies, and sanctifies it. Let us construct a simple illustration. Let us assume that in a primitive society, some needed foodstuff can be obtained only only by traveling to where it goes through treacherous, shark-infested waters. Twice every year, the men of the tribe set out in the precarious canoes to get this food. Now, let us assume that the religious beliefs of this society contain an article of faith that says that every man who fails to go on this voyage will lose his virility except for the priest, whose virility is sustained by their daily sacrifices to the gods. This belief provides a motivation for those who expose themselves to the dangerous journey and simultaneously a legitimation for the priests who regularly stay at home. Needless to add, we will suspect in this example that it was the priest who cooked up the theory in the first place. In other words, we will assume that we have here a priestly ideology, but this does not mean that the latter is not functional for the society as a whole. After all, somebody must go or there will be starvation. We speak of an ideology when a certain idea serves as vested interest in society. Very frequently, though not always, ideology systematically distort social reality in order to come out where it is functional for them to do so. In looking at the control system set up by occupational groups, we have already seen the way in which ideologies can legitimate the activities of such groups. Ideological thinking, however, is capable of covering much larger human collectivities. For example, the racial mythology of the American South serves to legitimate a social system practiced by millions of human beings. The ideology of free enterprise serves to camouflage the monopolistic practices of large American corporations, whose only common characteristic with the old-style entrepreneur is a steadfast readiness to defraud to the public. The Marxist ideology in turn serves to legitimate the tyranny practiced by the Communist Party apparatus, whose interests have about as much in common with Karl Marx as those of Elmer Granti had with the Apostle Paul's. In each case, the ideology both justifies what is done by the group whose vested interest is served and interprets social reality in such a way the, that the justification is made plausible. This interpretation often appears bizarre to an outsider who does not understand the problem, that is, who does not share the vested interest. The Southern racists must simultaneously maintain that white women had a profound revulsion at the very thought of sexual relations with a Negro, and that the slightest interracial sociability will straightway lead to such sexual relations, and the corporation executive will maintain that his activities to fix prices are undertaken in defense of a free market, and the Communist Party official will have a way of explaining that the limitation of electoral choice to candidates approved by the party is an expression of true democracy. It should be stressed again in this connection that commonly the people putting forth these propositions are perfectly sincere. The moral effort to lie deliberately is beyond most people. It is much easier to deceive oneself. It is, therefore, important to keep the concept of ideology distinct from notions of lying, deception, propaganda, or legerdemain. The liar, by definition, knows that he is lying. The ideologist does not. It is not our concern at this point to ask which of the two is ethically superior. We only stress once more the unreflected and unplanned way in which society normally operates. Most theories of conspiracy grossly overestimate the intellectual foresight of the conspirators. Ideology can also function latently, to use Merton's expression in another context. Let us return another time to the American South as an example. One interesting fact about it is the geographical coincidence between the Black Hat and the Bible Belt. That is roughly the same area that practices the southern racial system is in prison purity, also the heaviest concentration of ultra-conservative fundamentalist post-Protestantism. This, this coincidence can be explained historically by pointing to the isolation of southern Protestantism from broader currents of religious thought ever since the great denominational splits over slavery in the antebellum period. The coincidence could also be interpreted as expressing two different aspects of intellectual barbarism. We would not quarrel with either explanation, but would contend that a sociological interpretation in terms of ideological functionality will carry us further in understanding the phenomenon. Protestant fundamentalism, while it is obsessed with the idea of sin, has a crucially limited concept of its extent. Revivalistic preachers, thundering against the weakness of the world, invariably fastened on a rather limited range of moral offences: fornication, drink, dancing, gambling, swearing. Indeed, so much emphasis is placed on the first that in the lingua franca of Protestant moralism, the term sin itself is almost cognate with the more specific term sexual offense. Whatever one may say otherwise about this catalogue of pernicious acts, they all have in common their essentially private character. Indeed, when a revivalistic preacher mentions public matters at all, it is usually in terms on the private corruption of those holding of public offices, government officials still, which is bad. They also fornicate, drinking, and gamble, which is presumably even worse. Now, the limitation to private wrongdoing in one's concept of Christian ethics has obvious functions in a society whose central social arrangements are dubious, to say the least, when confronted with certain teachings of the New Testament and with the egalitarian creed of the nation that considers itself to have goods in the same. Protestant fundamentalism's private concept of morality thus concentrates attention on those areas of conduct that are irrelevant to the maintenance of the social system, and diverts attention from those areas when ethical inspection would create tensions for the smooth operation of the system. In other words, Protestant fundamentalism is ideologically functional in maintaining the social system of the American South. We need not we need not go on to the point where it directly legitimates in the system, as when segregation is proclaimed as a God-given natural order. But even in the absence of such manifest legitimation, the religious beliefs in Christian function latently to keep the system going. While the analysis of ideologies illustrates sharply what is meant by the social location of ideas, it is still too narrow in scope to demonstrate the full significance of the sociology of the knowledge. The latter discipline is not concerned solely with ideas that serve vested interests or that distort social reality. The sociology of knowledge rather regards the entire realm of thought as its province, not of course by regarding itself as arbiter of validity, which would be megalomaniac, but insofar as thought of any kind is grounded in society. This does not mean, as it would in a Marxist interpretation, that all human thought is regarded as a direct reflection of social structure, nor does it mean that ideas are regarded as completely impotent in solving the cause of events. But it does mean that all ideas are scrutinized carefully to see their location in the social existence of those who taught them. To the extent, at any rate, it is correct to say that the sociology of knowledge is anti-idealistic in its tendency. Each society can be viewed in terms of its social structure and its socio-physical and its psychological mechanisms, and also in terms of the worldview that serves as common universe inhabited by its members. Worldviews vary socially from one society to another and within different segments of the same society. On the same society, it is in the sense it is in the sense that one says that China's life in a different world from that a Westerner. To say to stay with the example for an instant, Marcel Garnet, a French ethnologist heavily influenced by Durkheimian sociology, has analyzed Chinese thought in just this perspective, or bringing out its different word. The difference, of course, is patterned in such matters as political philosophy, religion, or ethics. But Garnet argued that fundamental differences could also be found in such categories as time, space, and number. Very similar assertions have been made in other analyses of this kind, as those comparing the words of ancient Greece and ancient Israel, or the word of traditional Hinduism with that of the modern West. The sociology of religion is one of the most fruitful areas for this kind of investigation, partly, perhaps, because the paradox of social location appears here in particularly cogent form. It seems quite inappropriate that ideas concerning the gods, the cosmos, and the eternity should be located in the social systems of human, bound to all the human relativities of geography and history. This has been one of the emotional stumbling blocks in biblical scholarship, especially as the latter had tried to find what it calls the seeds in Lebanon, literally site in life, pretty much what we have called social location of particular religious phenomena. It is one thing to debate the timeless assertions of Christian faith, quite another to investigate how those assertions may relate to the very timely frustrations, ambitions of resentments of particular social strata in the polyglot cities of the Roman Empire into which the first Christian missionaries carried their message. But more than flat, the very phenomenon of religion as such can be socially located in terms of specific functions, such as its legitimation of political authority, of its assuagement of social rebellion, what Weber called the theodicy of suffering, that is, the way in which religion gives meanings to suffering, thereby changing it from a source of revolution to a vehicle of redemption. The universality of religion, far from being a proof of its metaphysical validity, is explicable in terms of such social functions. Moreover, the changes in religious patterns in the country of history can also be interpreted in sociological terms. Take as an example the distribution of religious allegiances in the contemporary Western world. In many Western countries, church attendance can be correlated almost perfectly with class affiliation, so that, for instance, religious activity is one of the marks of middle class status, while abstinence from from such activity characterizes the working class. In other words, there appears to be a relationship between one's faith in, say, the Trinity, or at least outward expression of this faith, and one's annual income. Below a certain income level, it would seem that such faith loses all plausibility, while above that level is become a matter of course. The sociology of knowledge will ask how this sort of relationship between statistics and salvation has come out. The answers inevitably will be sociological ones in terms of the functionality of religion in this or that social milieu. Naturally, the sociologists will not be able to make any statements about theological questions in themselves, but they will be able to show that These questions have rarely been negotiated in a social vacuum. To return to a previous illustration, the sociologist will not be able to advise people as to whether they should admit themselves to Protestant fundamentalism or to a less conservative version of that faith, but he will be able to demonstrate to them how either choice will function socially. Nor will he be able to decide for people whether they should have their infants baptized or wait until a later time for this act, but he will be in a position to inform them which expectation they will encounter in which social stratum. Nor can he even make a suggestion as to whether people should anticipate a life after death, but he can tell them which careers in this life will make it advisable for them to pretend at least to such belief. Beyond these questions of the social distribution of religiosity, some contemporary sociologists, for example Helmut Selsky and Thomas Lackman, have raised the question whether the personality types produced by modern industrial civilization permit the continuation of traditional religious patterns at all, and whether, for various sociological and psychological reasons, the Western world will not already be in a post-Christian stage. To pursue these questions, however, will take beyond our argument. The religion illustrations may have been sufficient to indicate in what way the sociology of knowledge locates ideas in society. The individual, then, derives his worldview socially, in very much the same way that he derives his roles and his identity. In other words, his emotions and his self-interpretation, like his actions, are predefined for him by society, and so is his cognitive approach to the universe that surrounds him. This fact, Albert Schweitzer has got in his ways world taken for granted, the system of apparently self-evident and self-validating assumptions about the world that each society engenders in the course of its history. The socially determined worldview is, at least in part, already given in the language used by the society. Certain linguists may have exaggerated the importance of this factor alone in creating any given worldview, but there can be little doubt that one's language at least helps to shape one's relationship to reality. And of course, our language is not chosen by ourselves but imposed upon us by the particular social group that is in charge of our initial socialization. Social predefines for us the fundamental symbolic apparatus with which we gauge the world, order our experience, and interpret our own existence. In the same way, society supplies our values, our logic, and the stock of information, or, for that matter, misinformation, that constitutes our knowledge. Very few people, and even they only in regard to fragments of this worldview, are in a position to re-evaluate what has thus been imposed on them. They actually feel no need for reappraisal because the worldview into which they have been socialist appears self-evident to them. Since it is also so regarded by almost everyone they are likely to deal with in their own society, the worldview is self-validating. Its proof lies in the reiterated experience of other men who take it for granted so also. To put this perspective of the sociology of knowledge into one succinct proportion, reality is socially constructed. In this proposition, the sociology of knowledge helps to round up Thomas' statement on the power of social definition, and throws further light on the sociological picture on the precarious nature of reality. Role theory and the sociology of knowledge represent very different strands in sociological thoughts. in sociological thought. Their crucial insights into social processes have not really been integrated as yet theoretically, except perhaps in the important contemporary sociological system of Talcott-Parsons, which is too complex to discuss within the present argument. A relatively simple nexus between the two approaches, however, is furnished by so-called reference group theory. Once more, an American development in the field first used by Herbert Hyman in 1940s. The concept of the reference group has been developed further by a number of American sociologists, among Robert Merton and Tamotsu Shibutani, are especially important. It has been very useful in research into the function of organizations of various kinds, such as military or industrial organizations, though this use does not interest us here. A distinction has been made between reference groups, of which one is member of those to which one orients one's actions. The latter variety will serve us here. A reference group, in this sense, is the collectively whose opinions, convictions, and causes of actions are decisive for the formation of our opinion, opinions, convictions, and causes of action. The reference group provides us with a model with which we can continually compare ourselves. Specifically, it gives a particular slant on social reality, one that may or may not be ideological in the aforementioned sense, but that will in any case be part and parcel of our allegiance to this particular group. Some time ago, there was a cartoon in the New Yorker showing a neatly dressed young collegian speaking to an unkempt girl marching in a procession with a sign demanding that the bomb test big band. The caption went something like this: "I guess this means that I won't see you at the Young Conservatives Club tonight." This little vignette aptly shows the choice of reference groups that may be available to a college student today. Any college of more than minimum size will offer a considerable variety of such groups to choose from. The affiliation-hungry student can join any number of politically defined groups, or he can orient himself towards a beatnik god, or he can latch on to a cycle of swift socialities, or he can simply hang around with the coterie that had formed itself po- around a popular professor of English. He goes without the saying that, in each case, there will be a certain requirements to be met in terms of his dress and the mature, sprinkling his conversation with left-wing jargon, or boycotting the local barber shop, or wearing button-down collars and repressed ties, or going barefoot after mid-March. But the choice of group will carry with it an assortment of intellectual symbols as well, symbols that had better be exhibited with a show of commitment, reading National Review or Dissent, as the case may be, enjoying Allen Ginsberg read to the accompaniment of the farthest out possible jazz, knowing the first names of the presidents of a string of corporations one has one's eye on, or envisaging unspeakable contempt for anyone admitting ignorance of the metaphysical pots. Cold-water republicanism, Trotskyism, Zen, of, Zen or New Criticism, all these august possibilities of Weltanschauung can make or mar one's dates on Saturday evenings, poison one's relationships with roommates, or become the best of stones alliance with individuals one previously avoided like the bubonic plague. And one then discovers that one can make some girls with a sports car and some with John Donne. Naturally, Only an evil-minded sociologist might feel that the choice between the Jaguar line and the Dawn line will be decided in terms of satiric exigency. Reference group theory indicates that social affiliation of this civilization normally carries with it specific cognitive commitments. One joins such one joins group one joins one group and thereby knows that the world is such by and such. One leaves this group for another and now knows that one must have been mistaken. Every group to which one refers oneself occupies a vantage point on the universe. Every role has a mold view dangling from its end. In choosing specific people, one chooses a specific world to live in. In the sociology of knowledge, give us a broad view of the social construction of reality. Reference group theory shows us the many little workshops in which cliques of universe builders hammer out the models of the cosmos. The social psychological dynamics that underlies this process is presumably the same we have already looked at in connection with role theory, the primeval human urge to be accepted, to belong, to live in a world with others. Some of the experiments conducted by sociophysiologists on the way in which group opinion affects even the perception of physical objects give us an awareness of the irresistible force of this urge. An individual confronted with an object that is, say, 30 inches in length will progressively modify his initially correct estimate if placed in an experimental group. All the members of which kept repeating that they are quite sure about the actual length being 10 inches or so. It should not surprise us, consequently, that group opinions in political, ethical, or aesthetic matters should exercise even greater force, since the individual thus pressured cannot have desperate recourse to a political, ethical, or aesthetic type measure. And if he should try one course, the group will deny that his measure is a measure in the first place. One group's measure of validity is another's gauge of benignness. Criteria of canonization or anathematization are, are interchangeable. One chooses one's gods by choosing one's playmates. In this chapter, we have singled out some strands of sociological thought that presents us with a picture of society existing within men, adding to our previous perspective on men within society. At this point, our picture of society as a great prison no longer seems satisfactory unless we add to it the detail of groups of prisoners busily keeping its walls intact. Our, our imprisonment in society now appears as something affected as much from within ourselves as by the operation of external forces. A more adequate representation of social reality now would be the puppet theater, with the curtain rising on the little puppets jumping about on the ends of their invisible strings, cheerfully acting out the little parts that have been assigned to them in the tragicomedy to be enacted. The analogy, however, does not go far enough. The Pierrot of the puppet theater has neither will nor consciousness, but the Pierrot of the social stage wants nothing more than the fate awaiting him in the scenario, and he has a whole system of philosophy to prove it. The key term used by sociologists to refer to the phenomena discussed in this chapter is that of internalization. What happens in socialization is that the social world is internalized within the child. The same process, though perhaps weaker in quality, occurs occurs every time the adult is initiated with a new social context or a new social group. Society then is not only something out there in the Darwinian sense, but it is also in here, part of our innermost being. Only an understanding of internalization makes sense on the incredible fact that most external controls work most of the time for most of the people in a society. Society not only controls of our movements, but shapes of our identity, want or thought and our emotions. The structures of society become the structures of our own consciousness. Society does not stop at the surface of our skins. Society penetrates us as much as it envelops us. Our bondage to society is not so much established by conquest as by collusion. Sometimes, indeed, we are cast into submission. Much more frequently we are entrapped by our own social nature. The walls of our imprisonment were there before we appeared on the scene, but they are ever rebuilt by our by ourselves. We are betrayed into captivity with our own cooperation.